They came expecting to defend their own continent. That was the plan. Take a few photos, roll their eyes at the excess, and go home with stories about how Europe still does it better. But somewhere between the first free refill and the first open door at midnight, the defense started to crack. Not because America seduced them with something extraordinary, but because it kept doing something they never thought to question at home, and doing it better, quietly, over and over again. It wasn't the landmarks that broke them. Europeans already knew the Grand Canyon would be big and the skyline would be tall. What they weren't ready for were the small failures of their own assumptions. The water that arrived without being asked for, the store that never seemed to close, the room that didn't require sacrificing space for comfort. Each one was minor on its own. Together, they started to form a pattern that no single photograph could capture. By the end of the trip, something had shifted that most of them couldn't quite name at customs. They weren't ready to say America had won, but they were no longer sure Europe had it all figured out either. This is the story of 8 small moments that changed their minds, and why, almost without exception, they found themselves already planning to come back.
As a Brit who has lived in the US now for going on 11 years, watching everyone descend upon this country for the World Cup is absolutely hilarious. Like, it's almost like we're being discovered for the first time. Like, people's reactions to stuff is so funny. Free refills, the bread rolls at Texas Roadhouse, Waffle House, P.F. Chang's I saw someone obsessing over. Like, it's like the fact that you can't walk anywhere. It has me in stitches. It's actually hilarious.
In most of Europe, ordering water at a restaurant is itself a small negotiation. Still, or sparkling, bottled, because tap water is rarely offered without being asked for twice. And once it arrives, it appears on the bill like anything else on the table, a line item, not a courtesy. Most Europeans never think to question this. It is simply what a restaurant is. So when a server in an American diner sets down a glass of ice water before any order has even been placed, the reaction is rarely gratitude. At first, it's confusion. Some visitors have described checking their menu, certain a charge would appear later. It never does. The water keeps coming, refilled without a request, as if hydration were assumed to be a basic part of hospitality, rather than a transaction to be settled at the end of the meal. The habit reveals something larger about how the American restaurant industry operates. Without the fixed pricing structures and value-added tax built into most European dining, restaurants compete less on regulation and more on experience. A free glass of water costs the business almost nothing, but it signals something a menu price never could: that the customer's comfort was considered before the customer even asked. Multiply that instinct across refills of coffee, bread baskets, and side dishes, and a pattern starts to form. Generosity as a strategy, not a virtue. For older travelers especially, the effect lands differently than it might for someone younger. It isn't the water itself that surprises them, it's the absence of friction. No flagging down a waiter. No calculating whether a second glass will cost extra. After decades of European dining customs where every request carries a small tax of effort, the removal of that friction feels less like a discount and more like being taken care of. It is a strange thing to feel moved by a glass of water, and yet several travelers asked to name their first real surprise in America mentioned exactly that. By the second or third meal, most stopped noticing it. In a small town in France or Germany, an unplanned need at 11 o'clock at night, a headache, a dead phone charger, a forgotten toothbrush, often means waiting until morning. Shops close by early evening. Sundays, in many places, are legally protected as a day of rest, and pharmacies rotate on-call schedules that require checking a posted list just to find out which one, if any, is open. Travelers accustomed to this rhythm rarely question it. It is simply how time works there. In America, that same need rarely waits. A pharmacy is open. A convenience store is lit up on the corner, its doors unlocked at any hour. A diner somewhere nearby is already serving breakfast, regardless of what the clock says. For a European visitor, the discovery isn't the products on the shelf. It's the realization that time itself behaves differently here, that commerce doesn't pause for the clock or the calendar the way it does at home. The reason sits deeper than convenience. American labor law imposes far fewer restrictions on operating hours than most European countries, and retail scheduling is left largely to the market rather than to regulation. Businesses stay open because staying open is profitable, not because a mandate requires otherwise. It's a small philosophical difference. Commerce answering to demand instead of to a fixed schedule, but it reshapes an entire country's relationship with time. For older travelers, this matters in a way that isn't always obvious at first. Health needs don't keep business hours. A forgotten medication, an unexpected ache, a need that can't be scheduled around a 9 to 5 closing time, these carry more weight for a 65-year-old traveler than for a backpacking 20-year-old. Knowing that help exists at any hour in almost any town removes a particular kind of anxiety that many hadn't realized they were carrying until it disappeared. By the second week of the trip, most stopped being surprised by the lit-up signs at midnight. But the underlying sense of security rarely fades. The quiet knowledge that somewhere nearby a door is always unlocked. Ask a server in Paris to swap the side dish, split a check 4 ways, or leave off an ingredient, and the response is often a polite but firm no. Not from unkindness, it's simply not how the kitchen or the system is built to operate. Menus are fixed. Substitutions disrupt a rhythm designed around consistency, not customization. Most Europeans learn this early and stop asking. In America, the same request is met with something closer to enthusiasm than resistance. Dressing on the side, sauce swapped, the check split 6 different ways without a sigh. The answer is almost always yes, delivered with a smile that, to a first-time visitor, can seem almost performative. Many travelers admit their first instinct was suspicion. Surely no one is this accommodating without a reason. But the accommodation rarely wavers, meal after meal, across cities that have nothing else in common. The reason traces back to how service workers are paid. In most of the country, a server's income depends heavily on tips, which creates a direct financial link between the quality of service and the size of the reward. In much of Europe, where wages are fixed and tipping is minimal or symbolic, that link doesn't exist in the same way. The American system isn't necessarily kinder, it's structurally motivated, but the visitor experiencing it rarely distinguishes between genuine warmth and financial incentive. What they feel is simply being prioritized. For a European tourist over 50, this often intersects with something more personal: dietary restrictions, allergies, or simply decades-old habits about how a meal should be eaten. Being told, of course, no problem, instead of being handed a fixed menu and a fixed answer, removes a friction that many had quietly accepted as unavoidable back home. It isn't about indulgence. It's about not having to negotiate for basic comfort at every meal. By the end of a trip, most visitors stop registering the flexibility as remarkable. But several, reflecting afterward, note that it changed how they thought about what a restaurant owed a customer in the first place, and how much they had unconsciously lowered their expectations at home. A hotel room in Rome or Amsterdam often carries centuries of architecture within its walls. Narrow staircases, low ceilings, a bathroom converted from what was once a closet. Charming, certainly, but charm and space rarely coexist in cities built long before modern travel existed. Most European travelers accept this as the cost of staying somewhere historic. A cramped room is simply part of the deal. The first night in an American hotel often produces a small, almost embarrassing moment of relief. The room is larger than expected, sometimes twice the size of what the same price would buy in a European capital. There's space to unpack a suitcase fully, rather than living out of it balanced on a chair. A bathroom that doesn't require choreography to use. For many visitors, this isn't the moment they expected to feel impressed by America, and yet several have described it as one of the first things that made the trip feel easier than anticipated. The explanation isn't glamorous, it's geographic. Land in most of the United States is simply more abundant and less expensive than in the dense, historic centers of European cities. American hotels, particularly outside major downtown cores, were built with room to spare, without the constraint of preserving centuries-old footprints. Space became a design choice rather than a luxury, because there was no architectural history forcing a smaller footprint in the first place. For older travelers, the practical benefit outweighs the aesthetic one. A larger room means easier movement, fewer obstacles, a bathroom that doesn't require squeezing past luggage to reach the sink. After a long day of travel, physical ease matters more than it once did, and a room designed with space in mind quietly removes a source of minor daily strain that many hadn't realized they were bracing for. By the middle of the trip, the space stops feeling remarkable, but it leaves behind a small, specific comfort, the sense that even the most mundane part of travel, the hotel room, had been considered with the traveler in mind. Visiting a national park in Europe often means a different fee at every gate. One price for the Alps, another for a preserved coastline in Portugal, another still for a historic site in Croatia, each transaction small on its own, but accumulating into a quiet, constant awareness of cost. Nature, in much of Europe, is treated as a series of individually priced experiences, something to be paid for one destination at a time. In America, the calculation changes entirely. A single pass, roughly $80 purchased once, grants entry to every national park in the country for an entire year. Yellowstone, the Grand Canyon, Acadia, Zion, dozens of others, all covered under the same piece of plastic. For a European traveler doing the math out of habit, the number seems almost implausible at first. Surely there's a catch, some additional fee waiting at the gate. There rarely is. The pass works exactly as described, park after park, state after state. What often surprises visitors even more is the ritual that comes with it. A small ink stamp pressed into a passport-style booklet at a ranger station marking each park visited. It costs nothing extra and serves no practical purpose beyond memory. And yet, many travelers describe becoming quietly obsessive about collecting them, planning entire detours just to add one more stamp to the collection. It becomes, almost accidentally, one of the most treasured souvenirs of the trip, not because it's valuable, but because it's earned. The system behind this traces back to a specific philosophy. National parks in the United States are treated as a form of shared inheritance, subsidized by the federal government and protected as public land, rather than managed as commercial ventures dependent on ticket revenue. Europe's fragmented approach reflects a continent of separate nations, each managing its own natural sites under its own rules and budgets. America's approach reflects a single federal decision made over a century ago that the wilderness belonged to everyone equally, and that access to it shouldn't depend on how much any one visit cost. For travelers over 50, many of whom plan trips around long, unhurried road journeys rather than single city visits, the pass removes a specific kind of friction. There's no need to calculate whether one more detour is financially worth it. The decision has already been made months earlier with a single purchase. What's left is simply the freedom to go. One park, then another, with nothing standing between curiosity and the next stamp in the book. In much of Europe, a long-distance road trip comes with a quiet undercurrent of arithmetic. Toll booths appear every 50 kilometers or so, each one requiring cash, a card, or a moment spent hunting for change. Speed limits shift from country to country, sometimes from region to region within the same country, and a driver crossing 3 or 4 borders in a single day must adjust not just their route, but their entire relationship to the road. Fuel is priced differently past every border. Road signs change language. It is manageable, but it is rarely effortless. And most European drivers have simply built the friction into how they plan a trip without ever questioning why it has to work that way. An American road trip operates under a different logic entirely. A traveler can leave the coast of California, drive east for days, and cross into New York without a single border checkpoint, without changing currency, and in many stretches without paying a single toll. The road simply continues, wide, consistent, and governed by the same basic traffic logic from one state to the next, even as the scenery transforms entirely. For a European driver used to negotiating each new country's rules, the sheer continuity of it can feel almost disorienting in its simplicity. Nothing about the experience demands vigilance the way a cross-border European drive does. The hardest part of the trip becomes deciding where to stop, not how to get there. The explanation goes back to a single deliberate decision made 7 decades ago. In the 1950s, the federal government committed to building a nationwide network of high-speed highways connecting every major city in the country, a project that would eventually stretch across more than 40,000 miles of road. It was conceived not as a patchwork of regional projects, but as a unified system, designed from the outset to move people and goods across enormous distances without interruption. Europe, by contrast, developed its road networks largely along national lines, each country building and maintaining its own system according to its own priorities, its own funding models, and its own toll structures. There was no single continental decision comparable to the one the United States made, only a collection of separate ones, layered over centuries of shifting borders and independent governments. The difference this creates isn't just logistical, it shapes an entire culture's relationship to distance. In America, driving 8 or 10 hours in a single day to reach a destination is treated as routine, even mundane, an unremarkable part of how the country understands travel. In much of Europe, where trains often replace long drives and where crossing that many kilometers usually means crossing several countries, the idea of casually driving that far in one stretch is far less embedded in daily life. The interstate system didn't just connect cities. It normalized the road trip as a category of experience in a way few other countries have replicated at the same scale. For travelers over 50, many of whom grew up hearing about the Great American Road Trip as a cultural rite of passage long before they ever experienced it themselves, driving the interstate carries a particular emotional weight. It isn't simply convenient. It's the fulfillment of an idea they'd absorbed from movies, books, and stories told by others. The sense that this specific kind of freedom, driving for hours toward a horizon that keeps opening rather than closing, exists in America in a way it doesn't quite exist anywhere else. Several travelers, describing their first extended American drive, mention a feeling less like tourism and more like finally understanding something they'd only heard about secondhand. The road doesn't just take them somewhere, it confirms an image they've been carrying for decades, one that until that moment had only ever been a story. Order a meal at a small cafe in one Italian town, then order the same dish by the same name in a town 2 hours away, and the results can be entirely different. Different portion, different preparation, different price, sometimes different quality altogether. This isn't a flaw in the system, it's simply how food culture works across much of Europe, where recipes are regional, ingredients are local, and consistency across distance was never really the point. Travelers learn to expect variation as part of the charm, even when that variation occasionally disappoints. In America, the experience runs in the opposite direction almost everywhere a traveler goes. A specific coffee order tastes the same in a small town in Ohio as it does in a suburb of Phoenix. A particular sandwich chain serves the identical sandwich assembled the same way, whether the location sits in a mountain town in Colorado or a strip mall outside Atlanta. For a European visitor, the first encounter with this sameness can feel almost eerie, a kind of culinary déjà vu that repeats itself, block after block, city after city, and yet, many travelers admit that after a long day of navigating an unfamiliar country, that predictability starts to feel less strange and more like relief. The explanation lies in a business model that took root in America earlier and more thoroughly than almost anywhere else, the franchise. Under this system, a company sells the rights to its brand, its recipes, and its exact operating procedures to independent owners across the country who agree to replicate the experience with almost no deviation. The result is a kind of engineered consistency, built not from a single company running every location, but from thousands of small business owners all agreeing to erase their own variation in favor of a shared, predictable standard. Europe's business culture, more fragmented and more resistant to standardization at that scale, never developed franchising with the same intensity or reach. Local ownership there tends to mean local variation, for better and for worse. There's a practical layer beneath the psychological comfort as well. American business law, particularly around trademark licensing and contract enforcement, made large-scale franchising easier to build and easier to trust than equivalent systems in many European countries, where regulatory environments differ sharply from one nation to the next. A franchise model that works seamlessly across 50 states would require, in Europe, seamless agreement across dozens of separate legal systems, tax codes, and labor laws. It's a structural reason for a shift most tourists only notice as a feeling, not a policy. For a traveler over 50 navigating a country they've never visited before, that predictability carries a specific kind of value. There's a difference between the adventurous unpredictability that appeals to a 25-year-old backpacker and the quiet reassurance an older traveler often values instead, knowing with total certainty what a meal will cost and how it will taste before ever walking through the door. It removes one more variable from a trip already full of them. Several visitors have described this exact feeling. After a day of uncertain menus, unfamiliar customs, and constant small decisions, walking into a familiar franchise anywhere in the country felt less like giving up on discovery and more like finding one fixed point in an otherwise unfamiliar landscape. By the end of the trip, most travelers stopped noticing the sameness as remarkable, but several mention, almost as an aside, that the reliability of it, the sheer boring, dependable consistency, became one of the small comforts they hadn't expected to miss once they were home. In many of Europe's oldest cities, history and accessibility exist in quiet conflict. Cobblestone streets, centuries-old buildings without elevators, museums reached only by narrow stone staircases, charming to look at, difficult to navigate for anyone with a knee replacement, a cane, or simply the slower pace that comes with age. Most travelers accept this as an unavoidable trade-off. Beauty in an old city often comes with stairs. America tells a different story, not because its buildings are newer, but because of a single piece of legislation. The Americans with Disabilities Act, passed in 1990, requires ramps, elevators, accessible parking, and usable restrooms in nearly every public building across the country, from national parks to fast food restaurants to hotel lobbies. It wasn't a suggestion adopted gradually by individual cities. It was a federal mandate, applied uniformly all at once everywhere. For an older European traveler, the effect is rarely dramatic in the moment. It shows up instead as an absence. The absence of a staircase where one might have been expected, the absence of needing help to reach a viewpoint. The absence of quietly deciding a place isn't worth the physical effort. Several travelers reflecting on their trip afterward mentioned this last, almost by accident, that for the first time in years, nothing about a new place made them feel limited by their own body. It is a small thing to build an entire law around. And yet, for many visitors in their 60s and 70s, it becomes the detail that stays with them longest. Not the landscape, not the food, not the size of the room, but the simple, unremarkable fact of being able to go everywhere they wanted to go. None of these 8 things, taken alone, would have been enough to change anyone's mind. A glass of water, a wider hallway, a stamp in a small book. Individually, they're the kind of details a person notices for a moment and then forgets by dinner. But travel rarely works by grand revelations. It works by accumulation. Dozens of small moments quietly stacking against an assumption someone didn't even know they were carrying. What most of these travelers came to realize, somewhere around the 5th or 6th day, wasn't that America had beaten Europe at anything in particular. It was that comfort, convenience, and ease had been built into the country almost invisibly, not as a boast, but as a baseline. Nobody in America was trying to impress them. The water was just water. The ramp was just a ramp. And somehow, that lack of performance made the impression land harder than any landmark could have. They didn't go home with a verdict. Most still love Europe, still return to it, still speak of its beauty in the same breath as its inconvenience. But something in how they measured a good day while traveling had shifted quietly without their permission. A country they'd been taught to see as loud, oversized, and a little much had instead shown them, one unremarkable detail at a time, what it feels like when a place is built with the traveler already in mind. Maybe that's the real question worth sitting with. Not which continent does it better, but how much of what we call charm is actually just something we've learned to tolerate.